I'm doing Ireland not so much from the point of view of David's book, because of course that chapter is being done by Nessa Cronin of the University of Galway. But she very kindly gave me a look at her chapter, an advanced look at her chapter, which I'm really grateful for. There we go. But most of this paper comes from work that I've done for another collected book about the peoples of the United Kingdom. So most of this is about creating the people of Ireland. How was it that the Irish people came to think of themselves as a people in a sort of singular way? And I think we can see from the earliest surviving records of Irish writing, both in Latin and in vernacular, we get a clear sense that the identity of the Irish people resided in their ethnicity as Gaels. So they wanted to know where the Gaels came from, what was their early history, who were the kings, how did their language originate. Since the writing of history was in the hands of literate clerics, the origin myths of the Gaels were synchronized with biblical events, so that Gaelic history became aligned with the model of world history laid down by the 4th century historian Eusebius. So this gave the Irish people an antiquity and a pedigree that was to sustain them throughout the tribulations of the medieval century. The most comprehensive attempt to record the history of the Gaels is the so-called Chronicle of Ireland, dated in its earliest incarnation to about 740. It's written mainly in Latin, but it has additions in Irish, and the Chronicle is the reconstructed parent text on which the surviving Irish annals up to 911 are based, including the Annals of Ulster, the Annals of Tigernach, and the Chronicon Scotorum. A version of it also travelled to Wales to become absorbed into the 9th century Historia Britonum, attributed to Nennius. The Chronicle of Ireland drew in part on Bede's Chronica Majora. It begins in 431 and was continued by later compilers up to the year 911, at which point the Chronicle was prefixed by a version of the world history of Eusebius. So there's a synthesis of biblical and secular history. So in this world history, the ancestors of the early Irish kings, who can trace their genealogies back to Adam, are shown to migrate from Asia to Egypt to Spain and finally to Ireland, all in synchrony with the events recounted in the Old Testament. The origin legend of the Gaelic people hinges on a character called Gael Glass, born in Egypt to Scota, the daughter of Foran, the Egyptian pharaoh, and her husband Niel, a Scythian warrior, and the son of Phineus Farsid, the Farsi or the Persian. There's a 9th century Old Irish poem, Duan Éireannach, Song of the Irish People, which tells the whole story of the family who gave their names to the Irish people. So in one section, it says the Féini from Phineus are named. So the Fenians are named from Phineus, not small Verinan. The Gaels from Gael Glass are called, the Scots from Scota. And so this is a sort of legend of how the different branches of the Irish people got their names. So the poem goes on to describe the journey of Gael's people, the Gaels, from east to west across the Mediterranean, imitating the journey of Aeneas and the Trojan survivors to Italy, as described by Virgil in his Aeneid. The Gaels eventually find their way to Spain, where generations later, Mil España, the soldier of Spain, and his followers, called the Milesians, invade Ireland and establish it as the nation of the Gaels. So all the royal tribes of Ireland trace their origins back to the Milesians and the division of the land into territories. This essential origin myth lies at the heart of the Irish pseudo-history, Lever Gabhala Éireann, the book of the invasions of Ireland, which was compiled between the 9th and 11th centuries and first survives in manuscripts from the 12th century. This heterogeneous compilation, beginning with the creation of the world and working through the foundation of Gaelic Ireland and the coming of Christianity, forms, as John Carey has said, a national myth which sought to put Ireland on the same footing as Israel and Rome. The end of the quote. Most significantly, the Book of Invasions lays unequivocal claim to Ireland as a Gaelic nation, the patria of a people chosen by God. The basic narrative structure of this complex text, which survives in 4 recensions and numerous manuscripts, is a chronological description of a series of invasions of Ireland by different people, leading up to the arrival of the first Gaelic people, the Milesians. So the earliest settlers in Ireland apparently arrived before the flood. All of them were wiped out by the flood, except for one man called Fulton, who survived through the ages and witnessed all these subsequent invasions. So the settlement of Partholon and his followers was a whole series of battles with the remaining inhabitants, the brutish and violent Fomorians. And after Partholon and his followers died from the plague, the Fomorians were left alive to persecute the next wave of settlers led by Nemeth. From the exiled remnant of this people came the Fir Bolg, literally men of bags, the first of the Irish peoples to be ruled by kings. When the next wave of settlers arrived, the Tuatha De Danann, people of the goddess Danu, they came with magical powers that enabled them to defeat firstly the Fir Bolg and then the dreaded Fomorians, who were at last expelled from Ireland, and the Tuatha lived there on their own until the final invaders, who were the Milesians, the first Gaelic people. The Milesians were skilled warriors who were able to defeat the Tuatha in battle, though the Tuatha were also able to use their magic to force a peaceful settlement. The result was that they did a deal. The land was divided into 2 parts horizontally, with the Milesians living above ground and the Tuatha living below ground in their fairy mounds. That's the origin of the She, the idea that these fairy mounds are under the ground in caves and other underground places. So the Book of Invasions lays unequivocal claim to Ireland as a Gaelic nation. Its combination of ancestry and language imposed a common ethnic identity on an otherwise fractured country, divided into numerous small kingdoms or tuatha, each with its own king, the Ree. The arrival of Christianity in the 5th century and its rapid expansion into a pervasive and organized structure worked to support rather than obstruct vernacular literature. The learned classes of Ireland, the Druids and the Feelith, or the poets and men of learning, were incorporated into the church's practices of Latin literacy and scholarship. Vernacular literacy therefore emerged very early in Ireland by comparison with the rest of Christian Europe, enabling a literary corpus which, through copying and circulation among growing audiences, became a major articulation of shared identity. While the Viking invasions of Ireland from the late 8th century instituted an urban culture and a certain level of commercialization that the Irish kings were inclined to embrace, the invasion and settlement of Anglo-Norman colonists from 1167 presented a more existential threat. The 13th century French poem, La Geste des Anglais en Irlande, Deeds of the Normans in Ireland, also known as the Song of Dermot and the Earl, is a celebration of the invasion of Ireland by Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare, the Earl of Pembroke, popularly known as Strongbow. Strongbow's ostensible purpose in first going to Ireland in 1167 was to support the claims of the King of Leinster, Diarmid mac Murchada, or Dermot MacMurrough, his anglicised name, against his neighbouring rival, the Kingdom of Connaught. In 1169, Henry II gave approval for an all-out invasion led by Anglo-Norman lords from Wales and their largely English troops. Strongbow returned to Ireland, captured Waterford, married MacMurrough's daughter, and made himself King of Leinster. When Henry II arrived himself in Ireland in 1171, the Normans, the Irish, and the Vikings of Dublin all submitted themselves to the English king. The French poem, composed in the last decade of the 12th century and surviving in a single manuscript, circulated among the English nobility as an origin legend of the English settlements in Ireland. It makes use of many of the conventions of the chanson de geste, including love stories, dramatic battle scenes, ambushes, betrayals, and a series of defeats of a large and unpredictable enemy who do not always fight by the rules. And here's a section here. When the English by their valour had grappled with the enemy, the Irish went away discomfited on that day from bad to worse. Like the Anglo-Norman cleric Gerald of Wales, who described Ireland in his Topographia Hibernica as, quote, separated from the rest of the known world and in some ways to be distinguished as another world, end quote. And he said about the Irish people that they live like beasts. So in that kind of vein, this French poem, La Geste, privileges the English over the Irish and represents the latter as a morally and culturally barbarous people whose innate violence justified the English invasion. For the Irish, of course, the narrative went very differently. The Irish version of the story of the English invasion of Ireland follows the plot line of La Geste, but is entirely engaged with tribal politics and laying the blame on Leinster, which caused all the original trouble. As in the Anglo-Norman poem, the Irish version starts with MacMurchada's abduction of the wife of Tigernán O'Ruarc, king of Breffni in South Ulster. So Breffni is just there in the north, just below Ulster. Deposed by Ruairi O'Conova, king of Connaught and the High King of Tara, MacMurchada went to England to solicit support from Henry II, which precipitated Strongbow's arrival in Ireland and the subsequent invasion. The Irish version is part of a poem addressed to E. O'Conova, or Hugh O'Connor, who died in 1316, and the poem was probably presented on the occasion of Hugh's inauguration as King of Connaught in 1293. While the Deeds of the Normans describes the Anglo-Norman lords who invaded Ireland and fought heroically with the Irish poem focuses on the cause of all the trouble, the rivalry between Connaught and Leinster, and the internal politics of those two kingdoms. The point of view is that of Connaught, with MacMurchada and his family blamed for bringing the English to Ireland, an act by which he has enslaved the fair Irish, says the poem. Proclaiming the superiority of Connaught, to whom Leinster ought to be paying tribute, the poet reminds his audience of the terrible consequences of MacMurchada's folly. Adva Dovroine derin is a cause of misery to Ireland to be in the grip of foreign captivity. It reddens a spot on her dewy countenance that Ireland should be in the bonds of foreign locks. The Irish sense of themselves as a people distinct from the English settlers was reinforced in a number of ways, especially through their legal system, their governance, and the Irish language. Literature in Irish continued to flourish in the period of the English settlements, forming an unbroken tradition of vernacular writing. As the Irish Church became increasingly a vehicle for the English crown, practices of writing became secularized, and Irish chieftains relied on their poets, lawyers, and historians to record the deeds of their tribes. One of the most significant anthologies of Irish writing was produced in the 12th century, the Book of Leinster, which preserved, during this time of upheaval, it preserved texts from the past that were crucial to Irish identity in the present, including the Levo Gabhala Éireann, the Book of Invasions, the Irish origin myth. Alongside genealogies of kings, an Irish grammar, and other foundational texts in the Book of Leinster, stands what is regarded by some as a genuine Irish epic, the series of tales that form the Táin Bó Cúailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley. Nessa Cronin, who's written the chapter on Ireland for David's book, has selected the Táin as her major text, and she calls it, quote, one of the epic narratives central to the making of the Irish cultural imagination, end quote. For those who are not familiar with the Táin, it is a series of episodes within a framing narrative, very much in the style of classical Latin epics such as the Aeneid. Set in a pre-Christian past, the framing narrative concerns the king and queen of Connaught, Ailill and Mev, who are determined to steal a sacred bull named Don Coolinear from their rivals in Ulster. And Coolinear is part of Ulster. It's a big province just up there, top right. The Ulstermen are led by their king Conover, based at his court in Evanmacha, which is down around there. And his ferocious army of Ulstermen includes a star warrior, a young man called Helen. Over a series of episodes in which the Connaught army invades Ulster and are impeded by a series of deadly single combats between Cuchulainn and individual Connaught warriors, resulting in gory violence and inevitable death. The story ends with an epic battle between the two armies of Connaught and Ulster, in which the Ulstermen prevail. But there is still one more battle to be fought, and that is between the two bulls, the white bull of Connaught, owned by Ailill and Mev, called Finn Benach, and the brown bull of Ulster, Don Coolinear, which was the cause of the whole invasion. Echoing the superiority of the Ulster forces, Don Coolinear defeats the Connaught bull, but then dies of his own wounds, resulting in a kind of draw between the two forces. This means that a peace deal can be agreed on, and the Connaught men return to their own lands. And this map, which appears at the front of one of the most famous translations of the Táin into English, shows the route of the armies and the sort of backwards and forwards journey that they make across the middle of Ireland. The story of the Táin is found in different versions in a number of manuscripts, but the version in the Book of Leinster provides the most coherent arrangement of events, forming a clear and slightly weird narrative. How old the actual tale is, or any of its constituent parts, is unknown, and opinion has oscillated between what's called the nativist view, that the tale was composed in pre-Christian times as an entirely native Irish story, passed down orally, untouched by external influences, and a somewhat more inclusive view that the story is probably of more recent origin, composed by Irish clerics who drew on their knowledge of biblical and classical allusions to fashion a text that used the past to validate the present. Nessa Cronin's chapter on the Táin looks mainly at the modern reception of the saga in Ireland through the medium of translations into English and into modern Irish and various other media as well. It's clearly sort of continued into the modern period as a key text of Irish identity. And there's a whole industry now of tours that you can take where you follow the route of the Táin and so on. So it's become a sort of tourist thing as well. Nessa focuses particularly on the 1969 translation by the poet Thomas Kinsella, which is where this map comes from. Kinsella had a specifically nationalist agenda, which Cronin describes as, quote, codifying an Irish national poetics within a European context, unquote, at a time when Ireland was attempting to join what was then the European Economic Community, the forerunner of the European Union. And Ireland did join the EEC finally in 1972. So Kinsella's translation came out in the late 60s during that period of sort of frantic lobbying for Ireland to join the EEC. But Cronin also considers the extent to which the Táin itself can be considered an epic and concludes, quote, it's been problematic as a candidate for being adopted as the national epic for reasons of theme, style, and form, end quote. There's also the issue of whether the Táin can be considered a national epic, given that there was no coherent idea of an Irish nation until the modern period. And of course, the island of Ireland is still split between the Republic and Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK. I'd like to take a slightly different line and suggest that despite the division of medieval Ireland into 5 provinces, which I showed you on that map there, despite the division into these 5 provinces and a number of sub-territories, each ruled by dynasties of kings and overkings, there was a sense, certainly among the clerical community, of the island of Ireland being a singular entity with a specific history and a singular people called the Gaels. So texts such as the Book of Invasions created an origin myth for the whole island. And even though the Táin may be an earlier composition commemorating an ancient rivalry between Ulster and Connaught in the north, its readers in the 12th century, following the Norman settlements in Ireland, were already primed to interpret regional events in the larger context of Irish cultural practice as representative of national identity. The Táin as a literary artefact is a product of native literary practice combined with Latin learning, translations of Latin secular texts into Irish, and Latin conventions of religious commentary, along with influences from the Bible, suggestive of a Europe-centred scribal community dealing with native Irish material. While the theories of James Carney and others regarding direct influence from classical epics on the Táin, particularly the Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid, have been rejected as too determinist, a more pervasive influence from Latin literary texts in general, particularly in terms of stylistic convention and genre, is entirely to be expected in the context of Irish scribal activity. Hildegard Tristram argues that the scribes who compiled the first two recensions of the Táin, including the one in the Book of Leinster, were drawing on models of writing with which they were already familiar, namely biblical commentary, exegesis, and translations of Latin narratives, Latin epics, into Irish, such as the 10th century Imhus Alexander, the Deeds of Alexander, and the Togil Tree, the destruction of Troy, which was translated in the 10th or 11th century. And there is a recension of Togil Tree found alongside the Táin in the Book of Leinster. As I've written elsewhere, there are clearly close links between these early translations from Latin and the native Irish tales. But it's suggestive that the translated Latin stories were crafted into narratives very like the Irish tales and not the other way round. The Book of Leinster version of Togil Tree, for example, is stylistically quite similar to recension 2 of the Táin found in the same manuscript. Rather than the translations influencing the literary production of the Táin, it is just as possible that the Latin stories were translated into an already existing native tradition of epic narrative, which had its own logic and organising principles. To conclude, I'm arguing that there are a number of early Irish texts that call into being the people of Ireland as a singular people. In this context, the Táin, with its echoes of both Latin epic and native Irish storytelling, can be considered a key text in the formation of Irish identity at a time of political and cultural conflict. Literary voices in medieval Ireland, whether writing annals, sagas, saints' lives, grammars, or bardic praise poetry, represent the viewpoints of a society long divided along strictly tribal and territorial lines. Even the arrival of Norman and English settlers, and then the heavy-handed apparatus of English state government, were not sufficient to unite the Irish against a common enemy. Instead, existing tribal and territorial rivalries were merely complicated by the addition of a new source of both support and competition. Yet there remained a cultural unity across the Gaelic regions of Ireland, a shared language and literature, a set of customs and a common history that bound them together as a people and which were ultimately strong enough to withstand the power of the English crown. Thank you.